I'm Ross Clarke. I'm a freelance journalist, and my book is called The War Against Cash, the plot to empty your wallet and own your financial future and why you must fight it, which is about the rather sort of underhand plot to turn our economy cashless so that we could only pay for things electronically via bank accounts, contactless cards, mobile phones, and have you.
Well, the obvious thing, Ross, is actually it's surely much easier to empty your wallet of cash than it is to take electronic money from you, because basically you're protected from electronic theft, whereas you're not from the theft of cash.
Well, theoretically, that's what the cashless lobby tell us. It's one of their arguments. Well, it'll cut out crime because cashless payments are traceable, whereas cash payments are not. But it just doesn't really stand up to examination. In 2015, Britain's lost a total of £750 million on online fraud. The criminals have gone cashless. They have no trouble extracting money from our pockets electronically. We know the scams and the frauds that go on. It's much easier in a way to transfer money around, launder money electronically than it is physically. I mean, if you try and carry a suitcase full of money through any airport, or certainly in the United States where they use cash sniffer dogs now, dogs that have been trained to sniff out ink on banknotes, you're liable to get caught. Whereas, we learnt this week that the number of cash mules who are being used by criminals to transfer money electronically around the world, there doesn't seem to be any effort going on to catch cashless criminals. If you go to your local police station and say, I've had some money stolen from me online, you won't get a very warm reception. It'll just be, well, just be more careful next time. It seems to be whole area of crime seems to be treated just as a sort of kind of occupational hazard of using online banking
I mean,
service.
surely there's this organisation called Action Fraud, which is supposed to look at this kind of crime actually very carefully.
Well, it's supposed to, but just because transactions are theoretically traceable doesn't mean that anybody is actually doing the tracing. As I said, £750 million was lost by British consumers in 2015 as a result of online crime. In Sweden, where which is further down the road than any country on the sort of cashless journey, as the payments industry like to call it, the year after that the banks there introduced a mobile phone payment system called Swish in 2013. The next year, the amount of cashless crime rose 37% because it's not as secure as it claims to be.
What about attacks like we had this cyber attack on the NHS earlier this year where someone is actually demanding electronic payments? Is there any way to stop that kind of thing? So I think that's one of the, basically I think they call it ransomware, where you're being held to ransom. You've got to make an electronic payment if you actually want to get your computer back working.
Well, exactly, and how many of those people get caught through the tracing of these payments? I mean, that cyber attack was foiled by an amateur hacker who was what they call an anti-hacker, or who
was later, by the way, he was later arrested by the FBI when he went to the United States to a conference.
You're quite right, but I mean, whatever went on there, I don't know, but it was sort of his public spirited act which ended that cyber attack, not the sort of authorities whom we charge with tackling online crime.
Yeah, so what's going on with the authorities? Why, for example, in a situation like that, cannot the people be traced? I mean, surely there is some kind of electronic trail that can be followed by police or by other sorts of law enforcement to find who it is that's the final recipient of this money.
Well, theoretically, yes, it can be traced, but the problem is it's quite complex to do it, and you know what happens if you get money stolen from you online. 5 minutes later, the money's been spirited abroad, and the police authorities in this country just don't have the resources or the inclination to trace the money across international borders. If you have money stolen from you, it's going to stay in the country certainly for a while.
I mean, surely the banks, the big banks. I mean, talking about your Lloyds, your UBS. They could, if they wished to, have quite a robust way of controlling and stopping the tracing of money which is effectively being used by organised crime. So, is there any reason why they wouldn't do that?
Well, I think the sort of whole financial industry seems to have decided, well, it's just cheaper to refund the money in cases where our systems have been hacked into, or in cases where it's the customer's computer that's been hacked into, or the customer has been duped into handing over passwords and that sort of thing. I mean, they can just wash their hands of it. And people have lost thousands of pounds in that way. I mean, there's one particular scam where you're buying a house. You've got to send a deposit to the solicitor. Criminals hack into the solicitors or your email account, send you an email which seems to come from the solicitor, says, oh yeah, you transfer the money into a different bank account. And of course it goes into a criminal's bank account and is never traced again. And you might think it's just a simple case. Well, whose bank account has it gone to? But what the criminals are very adept at doing is using other people's accounts to transfer the money through. So you find the money has gone into somebody else's account, then it's been extracted from there and sent around the world. And there's the electronic trail is extremely complex. I mean, I think they could eventually get on top of it, but we're being sort of pushed towards this cashless society when at a time when we're not on top of that.
What about accusations that you're a bit of a Luddite? Because surely, I mean, just the fact that there's so much now transactions going on the internet, and there's so much of a need, or certainly a perceived need for electronic money, aren't you just trying to hold back this technology, which is inevitable that it's going to take over?
I don't carry huge amounts of cash around with me. I have a debit card. I pay for things online. I'm quite happy to do that. When we're making that free choice, that's absolutely fine. There are other things that I won't have. I won't use a mobile phone payment systems. I don't believe they're secure. I don't use a contactless card because I don't believe that is secure.
I mean, have you got any evidence that they're not secure, these ways of paying?
Well, if you get hold of somebody's contactless card, you can go into any shop and buy anything up to £30, then go into another shop and do the same, and eventually you'll be asked for a PIN number or a PIN. That's a tautology to call it a number. But you could extract quite a lot of money from somebody's account very quickly through the use of a contactless card. As for mobile phone payment systems, I mean, I don't know the technological details of how they work, but I know that people have their phones hacked into, and I certainly don't want to pay for things that way.
Surely contactless is just getting so easy now. It's just blip. It's almost like as if you're passing over the cash, but there's nothing actually physically passing between you.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons the retail industry, of course, likes contactless cards, because it lowers our resistance to spending money. There's a rather nice report by the Dutch bank ING, which was quite honest about the way one of the reasons why cashless payments are being pushed at society. Said behavioural science suggests that when people do not handle money, they do not feel the pain. In other words, if we've got to get a fiver out of our pockets, well, that hurts. But if you just tap your card against a reader, you don't, that you've very little resistance doing it to doing that. So they think we can be persuaded to spend more money that way.
Well, you mentioned Sweden. Maybe you could tell us a bit more about how advanced the cashless society is going there. But there are also other countries that seem to be at the forefront of this, aren't there?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of developed countries, Sweden it leads the way, or we can call it leading the way. I would say leading the wrong way, but there you go to banks that don't handle cash. I mean, for example, as a lady turned up at a local bank. She'd raised some cash at a village fair and wanted to bank it in her, society's bank account. And the cashier said, well, cashier is probably the wrong term, isn't it? But person behind the desk said, I'm sorry, we don't handle cash anymore. We're an electronic-only bank. There's a lot of shops and restaurants now in Sweden which refuse to handle cash. Even the beggars on the streets in Stockholm, they've been issued with card readers, so that kindly folk wanting to give them money can do it via their cards instead. But I think one of the reasons why Sweden is why the Swedish banks are sort of pushing for the cashless society is that in Sweden 25 years ago that they had a very near banking collapse, and people came very, very close to losing their savings, and obviously the bank's interest that they don't want us to have the option of putting our savings in banknotes and so on, because obviously it undermines their own position in the economy. But that's Europe. But it's interesting, some of the biggest push towards cashless payments are in the developing world. I mean, the largest number of mobile money accounts, that's accounts where you pay on your mobile phone, it's not in Europe, it's not in America, it's in sub-Saharan Africa. Kenya is the world's leader in mobile money, followed by places like Bangladesh in Asia. And what I find quite disturbing really is the way the cashless lobby are using the developing world as guinea pigs for this technology. There was a trial in Bangladesh where factory workers were paid exclusively in mobile money. They didn't have no option of receiving their money in cash. The result was that there's about 40% of adults in Bangladesh are illiterate. They couldn't read the screens on their mobile phones. They couldn't use this. They couldn't access this mobile money themselves. They had to go to agents sort of sitting by the side of the road under large umbrellas and pay them to access their money for them. And what they do is say, I've been paid on this mobile phone, can you turn it into cash? And of course the agents extract quite a handsome fee for doing that. And it's as if the cashless economy is as if consumers in the developed world are rather shy of using it. So the cashless lobby has sort of hit upon the idea, well, why don't we push it on developing countries instead? And there's a huge amount of money resting on this. To take a figure from the Boston Consulting Group, at the moment, banks and payment companies extract $1 trillion worth of revenues from handling payments. By 2023, they've all calculated, well, they could double that to $2 trillion worth if they can persuade, or people can be forced to make cashless payments instead. So it just gives an idea of what the cashless industry sees in this.
Also, I understand India is another place where there's been a real attempt to reduce the dependency on cash by, for example, cancelling some of the higher denomination notes. Is there any reason why why that's a bad idea? I think they thought that there was quite a lot of forgeries, and so they decided to just get rid of them.
Yeah, what happened there was that the the government last November withdrew the high denomination banknotes, which is about 75% of the currency in India. And the idea was that their idea was that, well, a lot of these banknotes in circulation, they're held by criminals, and if we withdraw them, people have to go to the bank and they'll have to say, look, these are the old notes. Could I swap them for some new ones, or could I pay them into my bank account? And at that point, the bank would say, well, you'll have to fill in a form, and how did you get this money, and all this sort of thing. And they would therefore catch out a lot of criminals, or they would manage to basically cancel a lot of the criminals' wealth. But when it came to it, virtually all these old banknotes were handed in, and they were managed to change them for cash. So, it completely backfired. But meanwhile, it caused huge disruption to the Indian economy. People, particularly in rural areas with no access to banks, were simply unable to do business. They couldn't be paid, they couldn't pay for things, and of course they were the people who lost out, because there was a deadline of 31st of December. If you didn't hand in your old banknotes by that day, they would just be cancelled and you would lose the money. And a lot of people in rural areas, no access to banks, they found it impossible to meet that deadline, and it was they who lost out, not the criminals.
Interesting, isn't it? I mean, also that these things are being tried out, like as you said, almost like guinea pigs on the developing world. So over here, we've seen a sort of transition from the old cash and checks. I suppose that was kind of 1960s, 70s, through the credit cards, the debit card, a debit card payment that you sign for, and then the chip and pin, the latest being this whole contactless. The only trouble is there doesn't seem to have been any real meaningful either discussion, public debate about this move. I mean, to what extent are the banks simply just doing exactly what they want without any real check from the public or from Parliament or even from the press, the media?
Well, you're right. I mean, this whole drive towards cash, we're always told it's for our convenience, but it doesn't come from the public. It's not through public demand. What happened with the contactless cards? I mean, banks just sent them to consumers, said this is going to be your card from now on. You can use it in this way, and I was sent couple of contactless cards and I didn't want them, and I rang up the bank and I said, no, I don't think these are secure. I want a a classic card where I have to use chip and pin. Now the two banks that I bank with, they did send me non-contactless versions, but there's other banks which say no, you can only have a contactless version. And I say, I mean, that hasn't been arrived at through a consumer choice. It's just been forced on the population.
I mean, one of the things that I remember reading an article in the Daily Mail probably about 2-3 years ago now about people who actually were having money taken off of their contactless cards just through walking past a Marks and Spencer's where they were walking very close to a checkout, and the fact that the card was in a couple of feet proximity of one of these contactless terminals, you could actually be paying for somebody else's shopping. It doesn't seem as if it's really very secure, but it's well worth. I mean, they're also identifying how people know whether they've got a contactless card. It's got these kind of little, almost like, I think it's 3 or 4 kind of signs of a radiation wave coming from a dot on the card.
That's how you know whether your card is contactless or not. I mean, what you're referring to there was a trial by Which magazine, I think, where they tested these contactless cards. They're only supposed to be, the card reader's only supposed to read them if they're within very, very close, within a couple of centimeters or something. But in the trials, they proved that they could be read from sort of 15 centimeters away. Well, that's, you're walking past, somebody on the tube, or in a crowd can, if they've got a reader, a device which is able to read your card, it could theoretically dock money from a contactless card in this way.
I mean, you could actually, if you were a criminal, you could spend your day kind of just wandering around, taking whatever £30 off of everybody that passes you by in the street.
Well, yes, theoretically you could if if you can get hold of the right technology, and I don't know that it's become a huge problem yet, but it's certainly a potential problem.
What about the cost of these transactions? That's one thing that they're really selling this on, is that there's very little in the way of fees, which for example, if you're changing from one currency to another, obviously you have to pay a fee. With the electronic money, surely that's a lot easier than cash.
Yeah, well, in this country, we as consumers have become used to using debit cards without a fee. There are fees, though, for some credit cards. But overall, the cost of handling electronic money and electronic transactions, if you look at the overall cost that paid by the consumer and that paid by the retailer, electronic payments cost more than cash payments. I mean, the British Retail Consortium has done the figures, taking into account, the cost of hiring armoured vans to cart around the cash and all that sort of stuff. And I mean, they came to quite clear verdict that handling cash is cheaper than handling cashless transactions. But the costs are just a bit more sort of opaque, because as I say, in this country, there's no charge on your contactless card or your debit card. But when I was in Sweden last year, I went to a restaurant with my wife, and we went twice, 2 nights running. We went to and had exactly the same meal. And once I paid with a debit card, and the other time I paid with cash. Now, I worked out what it was costing me in each case, and it cost me significantly more to use the debit card than it did to use the cash. Even when you take into account the charges of withdrawing cash in Stockholm. But when I went to the cash machine told me exactly what charges would be docked from my account if I pressed the button and withdrew the cash. Whereas when I used the debit card in the restaurant, there was none of that. It didn't say you would be charged this, you will be charged that. It was only when I got home and looked at my bank statement I realised that I'd paid £1.50 in a foreign cash transaction fee or a foreign transaction fee, and I'd paid 2.5% or whatever it was of the transaction. It was completely opaque, and that is the world we will be in if we, allow ourselves to go cashless, because then the payments industry will be able to charge what it likes. It won't have what it now has is the competition of this free option of using cash. And that is the important role of cash. Even if we don't use it every time we go shopping, we know it's there. The payments industry know it's there. It acts as a vital form of competition to stop retailers and any banks and so on imposing fat charges on us.
Also, public transport is being used as a way to kind of train us, I guess you'd call it, to be using electronic money of one sort or another. I mean, it's impossible to use cash on public transport in London now.
On the buses, you have to buy a ticket before you board. You can't. I think you can use cash to buy the ticket if you go to the right machine. But last year, when I was a couple of years ago, actually, the government, the then transport minister, rail minister Claire Perry, she suddenly announced that planned to do away with rail tickets by about the year 2023. We're all rail travellers said we'll go cashless, and we'd have, our debit card would effectively become our ticket. I said, well, first this presupposes that everybody has a debit card. There's actually 1 in 10 of the population of Britain do not have a bank account, and most of us might find that extraordinary, but
Well,
it is nevertheless.
Maybe they shouldn't be travelling on the train.
Well, exactly. How are they going to travel? How do you travel if you haven't got in a cashless environment, if you don't have a bank account? But where was this? Didn't come from any public demand. It wasn't consulted on by the public. It was just sort of suddenly announced. And where it actually come from was a report had been compiled by companies which had an interest in selling the Transport for London and other rail companies the technology. I mean, it's just a sort of huge lobbying operation, and the sort of cashless initiatives seem to bubble up out of nowhere.
This is one of the things we are being told with this new Metro bus, which is about to be introduced here in Bristol after years of horrendous traffic delays. We're going to get a tiny little advantage to certain people who use this Metro bus to get in and out of the city centre, that none of that is going to be, you're not going to be able to use cash on that at all. So, I mean, it just bothers me, particularly with the use of mobile phones. I mean, what happens as you step onto the bus and your battery runs out?
Well, exactly. I mean, we were told we could use mobile phones. Every other day, if I'm out and about using my phone, by the time I got home in the evening, it's run down. And, if your mobile phone is your wallet, as we've said it will be in future, I mean, what do you do then? You're completely without money. What is wrong with retaining cash as an option? Another thing is what if the bank systems go down, as they do? I mean, there have been numerous failures of the payments infrastructure. Royal Bank of Scotland, some systems went down for a couple of days a few years ago, and in that time, people had no means of paying for stuff electronically with their cards. What the bank did on that occasion was it opened its branch and said, well, look, if you've got an account with us, come in and we'll give you cash to tide you over with. But, what do we do if there's no cash? I mean, the whole economy would grind to a halt. And then there's also the issue of remote places. If you're in a remote country location, often you can't get mobile phone reception, the broadband is non-existent. I mean, what do businesses do if they are in those locations? And I rather get the impression that a lot of this policy is sort of dreamed up by people who spend all their time in urban areas, in Wi-Fi spots and so on, and just don't appreciate the problems which you can have trying to make electronic communications in remote places.
Your book, Ross, is called The War Against Cash. What can we do? Is there anything we can do, or are we just being slowly shepherded down the road to a world of, these contactless cards, maybe even the human microchip?
Well, yes, there are 1 or 2 people in the world have had microchips implanted in their arms to pay for their coffee at work and so on, which is a bit of an ominous development. But no, what the rest of us can do is we can just resist it. We make it absolutely clear that we want to use cash as an option for paying for things. Boycott businesses which refuse to take cash, make a fuss when any kind of public service goes cashless. And, if we make it clear, if consumers make it absolutely clear they want to retain cash as an option, then I'm sure that cash will survive as an option. If we just go along meekly with the underhand campaign to turn us cashless, then we will later regret it. Particularly, I mean, something we haven't talked about actually is negative interest rates, because in the last recession, there's a lot of governments, a lot of central banks would have loved to impose negative interest rates where you put £100 in the bank, go back a year later and find you've only got 95 quid left or something. At the moment, they can't impose negative interest rates on us because they know that a lot of us would withdraw our savings and keep them in the form of banknotes under the bed or something. But in a cashless world, then it would give banks, central banks, governments huge capacity to manipulate the currency in that way.
Do you have any truck with conspiracy theorists who talk about this mark of the beast, where the Bible says you're not allowed to buy or sell without this in your hand or your forehead? I think it says in the Bible.
I don't know about that, but I know there is a very big lobbying campaign going on to drive us cashless, which very few people are aware of.
Okay, Ross, thanks very much for joining us on Dialect.
Thank you.
You're listening to dialectradio.co.uk, your local community radio run by volunteers. Log on to our website at dialectradio.co.uk to find out more.